It's after a gap that we are doing a book discussion, and we have to show greater determination in the Institute to make it a more regular feature. Today, happily, it's a seminal work that we are considering, India's War, the Making of Modern South Asia by Srinath Raghavan, is a great contribution to the history of contemporary India. And it's important because it's a neglected aspect of modern Indian history. We have another eminent modern historian, Professor Anirudh Deshpande, on the panel, and he is also a military historian. And we have squadron leader Chhina, who is secretary of the Armed Forces Historical Research Center in USI, and they have done much to delve into India's contributions to the First World War and the Second World War. And now he's working on a project begun by the government of Bangladesh to create a war museum in which they would like to contribute also memorabilia, artifacts, and reminiscences of the Indian contribution to the Bangladesh war, which is something that he is coordinating currently. There were 90,000 Indian casualties in the Second World War, which means that there were more killed and injured in that short World War than all the wars that India has fought since independence 68, 69 years ago. And if you compare that to the reticence of the Indian national leadership in evoking memories of our contribution to the war effort, it's not so startling because most leaders of post-independence India participated in the Quit India movement, and as Pranab Mukherjee wrote in his memoirs, and Srinath spoke about it in his interview with The Hindu, which many of you would have seen. He said that any commemoration event is like an insult to the independence movement of India. And it is disrespectful to the memory of the Indian National Army that fought under the leadership of Subhash Chandra Bose. This argument is very specious. Specious because look at the way modern India has treated members of the Indian National Army. I mean, compare it to the way the Nepalese have treated members of the People's Liberation Army. There was a civil war in Nepal not so long ago, and at the end of the civil war there was a process of political reconciliation. There was a 12-point agreement and a comprehensive peace agreement, part of which was that those who volunteered to join the Nepal army would be given an opportunity to do so. Not only was that opportunity not given, but members of the INA who needed medical attention or pensions, etc., were denied that. And then to talk about being disrespectful to the memory of INA and using it as a pretext for disregarding the contribution of Indians to the war effort is not right. So some of that has been remedied by India's national leadership today, and there is a more open embrace. What is significant about the book is that it highlights the fact that India's participation in the Second World War towards the end of the national movement phase and just preceding India's independence actually contributed to the freedom of India. The naval ratings mutiny also contributed in a sense. The psychological factor of the INA also contributed. And again, as Srinath has quoted Churchill, fearing this 2.5 million mobilization of Indian men, saying that they could stab us in the back. That factor also played on the British minds, and this is perhaps the reason why they speeded up the date of their departure. But in the process, It is India's involvement in the war effort, and this is brought out in the book, increased the salience of the Muslim League and Muhammad Ali Jinnah in the political equation in pre-independence India. And in a sense, a lot of historians argue that there was an inevitability of the partition of India, but certainly that became a foregone conclusion by the Indian national movement led by Congress party being on the sidelines and a more prominent play being allowed for the Muslim League. There was also social transformation involved in this mobilization, because the British, in order to recruit, had to go beyond the so-called martial races. And that explains Ambedkar's enthusiasm. He saw the Second World War mobilization as an opportunity for social mobility of the backward communities. And then it also led to industrialization of India. There was a 61% increase in output. There was a million plus people added to the industrial workforce. And this is not due to British benevolence, because you saw this trend already in the First World War. Whenever the physical connection between the imperial power and the colony got disrupted, there was a spurt in industrial development in the country, and immediately post-war a continued inflow of capital goods, etc. So in a sense, we got very partially compensated for the incessant deindustrialization of India that had occurred for the preceding century and a half of British rule. And then I think another startling fact, which although I've read modern Indian history a long time ago, but I was not familiar with this, and this was a revelation, that in terms of the financial contribution of India, it is very well known to all of us that all the British outposts, colonial outposts from Aden to Singapore, were financed by the poor Indian taxpayer. And that is the reason why many of the embassy and residences where I have lived just before I retired in Kabul and Kathmandu were former British residencies which we inherited because they were paid for by us. And for instance, in Kathmandu, we gave the forest officer's house where the British ambassador currently lives in a much smaller compound, which Jawaharlal Nehru graciously gifted to the British. So it was all part of that, poor Indians sustained British imperialism in a significant way. But during the Second World War, and this is startling, the net contribution of India between 42 and 44 was 27 million pounds sterling more than that of the United Kingdom. And at the end of the war, the outstanding funds available, the sterling balances available with Britain were 1.3 billion pounds sterling, which India continued to use till the late 50s. And that's the reason why more than 50% of the size of the High Commission of India, London, was made up by the India Supply Mission, which Ambassador Raskotra finally shut down, and more than 50% of the staff had to go. And there is a story attached to this, and now after reading your book, the penny has dropped, because when I was staff officer to the Foreign Secretary, I had to deal with a very troubling case with one of the parliamentary committees on how Ministry of External Affairs had allowed unauthorized expenditure by the High Commission. There was a South Audley Street property that we had, and in connection with the Festival of India, we tried to renovate it, and the early estimate was 50,000 pounds sterling. So High Commissioner Raskotra started the work, and then they found out that the plumbing was wrong and the electricity had to be redone, and then he wanted a very spanking building for eventually what became the Nehru Center. So millions of pounds were spent on that building. but there was no sanction from the ministry and there was no transfer of funds from India. And there was an old arrangement between the Bank of England and Reserve Bank of India that when the balances of the Indian High Commission fell below 100,000, it was automatically replenished. And so all the bills continued to be paid. And we thought that there would be some kind of settlement at the end of the year, and we checked from RBI, there was no settlement. So the South Audley Street property had got reconstructed through that arrangement, which now it appears to me was part of the use of the sterling balances by independent India. So this is a book with such fantastic nuggets of information, and extremely well researched. It's I wouldn't call it a magnum opus, but it's a tour de force and a kind of history that must be written, more of it. And I have the pleasure to now give the floor to Dr. Raghavan to provide us an overview. And then we will have the discussants, two of them, Squadron Leader Chhina and Professor Deshpande speak thereafter.
Thank you very much, sir, for that very kind and actually very interesting. I'd rather not speak and let you tell us a few more anecdotes about these things, which I think is always very illuminating. It's really a pleasure to be back here at IDSA and to see many old friends. I'm also delighted to be on this panel with Professor Deshpande, whom I know from the time I was a student, literally, and whose work has been, in many ways, the foundation for the book that has been written here. And also with Squadron Leader Chhina, who I think has done more than anyone I can think of in making sure that we really put our pre-independence military history on the map and make sure that public memory doesn't sort of slide over these things quite as quickly. So what I want to do, and I'll try and not take more than about 15-20 minutes, is to give you a sense of what are the various things that I've tried to do with this book. So maybe I should just begin by trying to tell you why I wanted to write a book like this and what is it that this book is trying to do. The simple answer to that question is that there was simply no single volume on India in the Second World War. There are a number of very, very good specialized studies. Professor Deshpande himself has written a seminal book on British Indian military policy in the interwar period. There are others, not very many, a handful of them, but nevertheless, a bit like the pre-Second World War Indian Army, it is a small force of military historians who are very high quality nevertheless. And we've got some excellent work on various aspects of it, but there has been very little attempt to pull everything together. And when I began to sort of research the book, there were only two other books that I could see sort of falling into that category. One of which was by an excellent German scholar written in the late 1970s, and the second were these two fantastic volumes by Chris Bailey and Tim Harper, but which looked more at the war in Eastern India down to Malaya. So it's not about India as such there. Happily, since from the time that I have sort of written and more or less published this book, there have been at least two other books which have been published. One by Yasmin Khan, which focuses on the sort of home front, so to speak. So in a sense, we ended up writing very complementary books. And most recently, there has been a new book by Kaushik Roy on the Indian Army. I'm told in the Burma campaign. I'm afraid I haven't had a chance to read it, though again, his papers and other things which he very kindly shared with me have been very useful in my own work. So the idea of writing the book really was to provide a single volume account of the war, which would bring in the various facets and various dimensions of it. So in that sense, this is very much an exercise in synthesis and not so much in the monographical sort of writing of it, right? So, which also meant that I made very extensive use, not just of published material by other scholars, but also of a now sadly forgotten sort of series of volumes on the official history of the Second World War. 25 volumes which were published between 1950 and 1964, which in many ways are still very useful, if only and sadly because much of the material that was used, the primary material, is no longer that easily accessible to historians. I mean, if you try to go to the National Archives, for instance, it's stunning to find that they don't even have a catalogue for the military department in the Second World War, right? So they'll tell you that the home political is here, you can look at the foreign, you can look at various kinds of things. But when a war is being fought, you would have imagined that the military department's catalogue would have precedence, but they simply didn't have it. So funnily enough, even though I undertook this project thinking that it'll be easy to do it sitting in India, I ended up doing a lot of the primary research in the India Office Library, so which once again is a bit of a sad point. No? So what are the various things that I'm sort of trying to do? So the first sort of major big argument of the book, and then I'll sort of break it down into its component parts, is to say that much of the way that we think about the last decade after of the colonial period, the period between say 1939 and 1947-48, basically assumes that the Second World War is providing some kind of a very distant backdrop to events which are fundamentally India-centric, right? And in a sense, the war does give impetus to the resignation of the Congress ministries, which have come into power after the 1936-37 elections. But then most history books, the standard accounts that we have, very quickly will move on to the Quit India movement. The Crips sort of offer the Quit India movement. Then you sort of basically begin the post-war period, right, with the Simla Conference, the cabinet mission, discussions leading up to partition, independence, right? So that, broadly speaking, is the sort of narrative plotting of the way that we think about the history. And there, the war is basically something which is happening very much in the background and doesn't really come into front and center. So what I wanted to do was really to change this order of precedence and put the war front and center in our understanding of the 1940s, and try and make an argument about the centrality of the war as a historical sort of event. And there were two broad large things I wanted to do with this book. One was to tell the story of what India did for the war, which is to say that the story of the military contribution, the sort of economic contribution, as the DG mentioned, and other things. But also tie that in with the story of what the war did to India, right? So what are the kinds of political, social, economic impact of the war, and the longer term things. So those were the sort of two major things, and the sort of major central claim of the book is that in some ways it is very difficult to understand why the 1940s turned out the way that they did for the Indian subcontinent, especially in terms of the sort of major processes of partition and other things, if you do not take the war into account, right? And there are 5 large themes that I try and pursue in this book, even though the book is very much a narrative history, but the idea is to sort of keep the chronology going with some thematic treatment interspersed within it. And I'll quickly sort of try and outline what the 5 themes are, and then what are the major sort of points that I want to make there. So the first really is a sort of, the strategic picture of India's role in the war, right? So one way of thinking about it is very much the way that, President Pranab Mukherjee says, right, which is that India was basically an imperial possession, and that we were more or less willy-nilly taken into this war against all our wishes and so on. So I think as a statement of fact, that is pretty much true. There is nothing very much to dispute with that. But the problem is that it also leaves out certain very important aspects of the picture, which at least are important for historians, if not for others. And that particular thing, and here I draw on the work of scholars like Robert Blyth and others who have sort of shown us that it is useful to think about India as an imperial sort of appendage. But it's also very important to remember that India did not fit into the empire in any normal sense, right? I mean, there was a good reason why, the British used to rule India for something called the India Office, while they had a colonial office for something else, and subsequently a foreign commonwealth office for other things, right? That is because India was an anomalous sort of category within the British Empire. And the centrality of India stemmed from the fact that India was actually a sub-imperial system of a certain kind of its own, right? Which is to say that there was the British Empire in the Indian subcontinent, the physical subcontinent, but that particular subcontinental entity had a sub-imperial system where it could sort of interfere and influence and have a number of things going for it, right? And that particular sub-imperial system stretches in the east, certainly from Hong Kong, Shanghai, down to Singapore, Malaya, Burma, up to Tibet, and on the other side, Afghanistan, both of which were sort of seen as this thing. And also in Xinjiang. I mean, in fact, the British sort of outpost the diplomatic outpost in Xinjiang used to be funded by the revenues of the government of India. And that, if I'm not mistaken, sir, was only sort of reformed in 1949. And I think Mr. Ram Sate, who later became our foreign secretary, was the person who sort of wound up that from Kashgar. So there's this entire swathe of territory. And then you had southern Iran, which again, from the 19th century onwards, had always been an area where the Indians claimed a sphere of interest. Subsequently, what became Iraq, etc. And then the entire sort of, area along the Persian Gulf states, all of which, the crucial states as they used to be called, were sort of had arrangements with India which were roughly analogous to what the Indian princely states were at that point of time. And then you had an entire belt of territory stretching from Aden down to the eastern coast of Africa, right? So this whole sort of arc from east to west, in some ways, was centered on India, and India was performing many different kinds of functions there, right? Like all sub-imperial systems, so there is a core and there are various parts, and those parts are linked to the core in various ways. So the first was, of course, political, which is to say that many of these were either directly or indirectly under the rule of the government of India at various points of time, though of course by the time we come to the Second World War, the story is sort of somewhat dated. Their legal political systems overlot to the innovations within India in terms of the way that the British administrative grid functions here. Indian capital was quite important in the construction of various kinds of infrastructure, the running of various kinds of agricultural oriented businesses, export crops, etc. To take the case of something like Burma, for instance, which in the 1930s was the largest rice exporting country in the world, the Burmese rice trade was fundamentally fueled by Indian capital, right, and then native Indian capital, not British Indian capital. And similarly, you had Indian labor, which was a very important part of the workforce in many of these things. Some 30 million Indians are expected to have sort of moved from the subcontinent to various parts of the sub-imperial system in the course of the period from 1830 to 1930, right? And then lastly, and the one link which remains continuously important is the military and security one, which is to say that many of these areas were conquered by the support of the Indian army. They continued to be sort of policed by police which was recruited from India, and the Indian army in the last instance was the force which was guaranteeing and underwriting their security, right? So in that sense, the strategic sort of dimension of India is quite important to recover, because otherwise it becomes very difficult to make sense of why is it that the Indian army was fighting in all the places that it did during the Second World War, right? Or actually even during the First World War, to the extent that there were conflicts in these areas. And in a sense, the argument there is that it's important to think of India as a sub-imperial system, as a regional power, really, which had the ability to project its power and influence across this area. And while much of this was pretty much on the wane in the interwar period, the Second World War gives one last opportunity for India to sort of play that role. And that I think is quite important, not just in a historical way, but also all history is contemporary history, right? We look at the past with eyes of the present, so given all the discussions that we have today about power projection and such like things, I think this is a history which is worth recalling in some ways. The second sort of related to the strategic sort of thread to the story here is the international dimension of the whole thing, right? And linked to it is a fact that, again, India had a very anomalous international position in the period running up to the Second World War. India was a signatory to the Treaty of Versailles, and it was a founding member of the League of Nations, even though it was a colonial territory, right? And it also of the ILO, it took part in the various disarmament conferences of the 1930s, of the economic sort of conferences during the Great Depression, and so on. And all of that was once again a reflection of the fact that India was something more than simply a part of the British Empire, right? Of course, the British benefited from the fact that they could use Indian representation to push other kinds of points. But over a period of time, what you do see is that there are sort of areas where the government of India has a very different view from the British government in London on the various things. And the international dimension becomes particularly important during the Second World War for two reasons. The first is that India's ability to play this kind of a role of a sub-imperial system relies on the fact that you expect that the Far East, which is East Asia, in some ways is quiescent. There is no conflict happening there. There is no major revisionist power out there, right? And so long as there is an Anglo-Japanese sort of treaty, which was there for the first half of for the first decade of the 20th century, you could work on the assumption that there is no revisionist power, which is challenging the sort of British hold there. So Indian army doesn't need to sort of perform those functions. Similarly, in terms of the Middle East, so long as no major European power was capable of sort of making a thrust into that part of the world, the Indian ability to sort of police this system within its own resources was quite to be taken. But both of these assumptions proved to be completely sort of overboard once the Second World War began, right? In fact, when the war begins, a very interesting thing is for how long, at least for the first 2 years of the war, the fortnightly report from the sort of Governor General of India would begin by discussing the military picture by looking at Afghanistan first, right? So in that sense, I mean, the fixation with the potentiality of a major threat coming from Russia through Afghanistan continued to be there until the Soviet Union was attacked by Nazi Germany, right? And that it's in some ways also shows us what the strategic military priorities were, right? It was always the Northwest frontier and what happened there. And in some ways, you're completely caught out by what happens in the East. Of course, most the people in the government of India knew that they were very weak as far as the Far East was concerned, but nevertheless assumed that the Japanese would not want to attack and so on. So you operated on a set of assumptions which proved to be completely false. And in that sense, the international context in which India would play that role fundamentally transformed. The second way in which it was fundamentally transformed was the entry of the United States into the conflict, right? Because once the United States comes into the conflict, the United States starts looking at India as a very important sort of part of the allied sort of forces, especially in terms of its ability to support, to provide men, material, goods, serve as a logistics base, and so on. Right? From early 1942. You had sort of various kinds of missions from the United States, political and economic, coming in to look at what India's war potentiality was. This was also the time when the United States decided to extend the Lend-Lease program to India, and that led to the appointment of the first Agent General of India, Sir Girija Shankar Vajpayee, in the United States, because his job was really to coordinate all the Lend-Lease supplies to India. And in many ways, the entry of the United States into the war and into sort of playing this quite important role changes the contours of everything. Very few of us realize what the extent of American sort of involvement in India was during the latter half of the Second World War. In the period between 1943 and 45, the United States was very heavily involved in India, especially once a decision was taken in 1943 that India would become a sort of a major allied logistics and supply base. The Americans were very involved in creating a lot of infrastructure all across India. Of course, they had their own fish to fry because they wanted to support the Chinese nationalist Chiang Kai-shek's armies by sort of flights over the hump and such like things. But at the same time, they played a very important role in construction of airfields, in sort of bringing in new technologies of port development. How do you sort of turn around things quickly? In fact, for about a period of 18 months or so, the United States Army Railroad battalions actually operated a stretch of the Bengal and Assam Railway, the last 800 miles of it, the most difficult parts, because you had to sort of move from a broad gauge line to a meter gauge line, then you had to move to a ferry system and then unload and then do that, right? And there, the American sort of principles of management of inventory, new technology that they could bring in, new principles of management, etc., were fundamentally important. So in that sense, the US involvement in India it was quite transformative. And the international dimension then sort of leads us to the other sort of part of the story, which is domestic politics and politics in India itself. And the reason the Americans were involved in India was because they understood quite early on, once they got involved in the war, once the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, which is the same time that they attacked Southeast Asia as well, that if India has to sort of play its the role that it potentially the Americans believed that it could, as both a place for supply of manpower and of equipment, and it's given its geographic location, then they believed that the Indian nationalists would have to be taken on board for the war effort in a way that the British government was not willing to do. And that is a part of story which is reasonably well known, and I sort of covered the early bits early on, which is to say that it is a very striking thing that at a time when the Government of India Act of 1935, etc., has been done, most imperial historians, so to speak, will tell you that the British had more or less decided to sort of part away with India. You had possibly the most conservative and indeed reactionary sort of leadership both at the helm in India, in the figure of Lord Linlithgow, and Prime Minister Winston Churchill there, right? Between the two of them, they made sure that Indian nationalists could not be co-opted into the war effort on any sort of meaningful terms. In fact, people like not just Nehru, but also Gandhi, Patel, everyone, were completely torn between wanting to sort of, on the one hand, support the war effort, and on the other hand, having some reasonable basis on which they could cooperate with the British, right? So the British were not willing to promise anything concrete for what the post-war future of India would be. They kept sort of bringing up this bogey, saying that the Congress is not the only spokesperson of the country, which is why then you have this whole play given to the Muslim League and Jinnah, right? Let's not forget the elections of 1936-37 in some ways established the political ascendance of the Congress party in a very huge way, right? The Congress was in power in a number of provinces, and the Muslim League did terribly even in the Muslim sort of reserved seats, right? But then Jinnah is given a lease of life because Linlithgow wants to have political counterweights to the Congress party, right, from the very beginning. And it's not just Jinnah, but also there are other people who are sort of given. The Hindu Mahasabha and Savarkar are sort of practically bought in from nowhere. I mean, someone like Savarkar had no interaction with the government of India in the run-up to that period. Much the same is the case with Ambedkar, who was again sort of bought in, and in fact Ambedkar served in the government of India in the Viceroy's Executive Council from 1942 onwards as the Labour member, right? So the British government tried therefore to bring in a number of other groups which would serve as counterweights to the Congress party and keep the sort of Indian political scene divided, and that was used as an excuse to say that no constitutional reform could be contemplated while the war was still going on, right? And the Americans, at least in early 1942, tried to sort of get the British to move away from that position. In fact, the Cripps mission was sent partly to countervail American pressure, right? In fact, when the Cripps mission fails, there is a wonderful entry in the diary of Leo Amery, who was the Secretary of State for India. He says that today I feel like a man who has been forced by his parents to get engaged to a girl he doesn't like, and the girl is now called off that engagement, right? So that exactly was it. So the assumption that somehow this was a good faith attempt to bring in Indians doesn't stand to scrutiny. But the problem, of course, was that once the Quit India movement began, then President Roosevelt and the Americans sort of slowly backed away from pushing Churchill and the British to do anything politically in India, which is why then you have a period of political stasis. The Congress leadership is in jail, and that gives a lot of cover for the Muslim League to expand its presence steadily across India. So, which is why, if you read Jawaharlal Nehru's Discovery of India and the sections which he has written after he comes out of war, he says that this country is more or less unrecognizable to me today, right? I mean, the kinds of communal passions that I see and hear, I can't even sort of remember having seen something like this. So, in a sense, there's a dramatic transformation of the political scene which happens in this period, which would have all kinds of consequences going forward, right? Because by the time you have the 1946 elections, the Muslim League does extremely well in Muslim sort of reserved seats all across India, right? Even in places like South India, the Muslim League does well. I mean, it's difficult to think of, say, I was just looking up some of the seats. Even my hometown, Coimbatore, I mean, the Muslim League sort of won seats in the reserved Muslim category, right? I'm hard pressed to think who in Coimbatore could have imagined that they could have sort of been part of Pakistan, right? But nevertheless, that was the appeal which the Pakistan sort of movement had at that point of time, and the reason they were able to establish it was because the Congress was kept completely sort of out of the picture. And now, this sort of fractured politics, in a sense, had knock-on consequences for my fourth the fourth theme that I talk about, which is about the home front in India, right? Which is about the way that resources within India were mobilized for the war effort, right? So on the one hand, it meant that the war never really had the kind of popular backing that you would have expected it to, right? And there are many good indices. I mean, people like Indiva Kamtekar have shown us how, off-take on, say, British war bonds during the Second World War were much lesser than what they were during the First World War. I mean, the subscriptions were always undersubscribed. The British had a very difficult time trying to raise sort of finances from India. In a sense, there was hardly any enthusiasm for that. And some of the more clear-minded people within the government of Britain, like Leo Amery, actually recognized. In fact, Amery says at one point that India is a sort of feels that it's been coerced into this war, and we have done very little to sort of change that opinion. And that, I think, was quite important. Right? But the fractured sort of politics also meant that the British were able to sort of mobilize selected groups which were quite important. So why was the Muslim League important? As I said, there was a political reason to it. But the Muslim League was also quite important to it because the British believed that the two Muslim majority provinces of Bengal and Punjab were fundamentally important for the war effort, right? Punjab being the main reservoir of military manpower, and Bengal, might sound very funny today, but was one of the most industrialized provinces of India at that point of time, right? And then both of these were very important, and they believed that to have one central leadership of the Muslim League to take control of both of these would have been a very useful thing. Similarly, the fact that they were able to sort of, bring in people like Savarkar and more importantly Ambedkar and other tribal leaders like Jaipal Singh and others meant that the British were able to tap into communities which saw the Congress as fundamentally an upper caste Hindu-dominated organization, right? Which in some ways was not incorrect. And which is why you find that when the expansion of the Indian Army happens, a lot of the newer groups which are bought in, and many of them are not sent into combat groups. So to that extent, the martial races theory actually remains, at least in practice, in place. But to the extent that the expansion happens, a lot of it happens from groups in South India, many of which are lower caste groups, North India Dalits, and if you say take the example of the Punjab, I mean the Sikh light infantry, which is sort of basically from the Dalit Sikh communities are being recruited, right? So in that sense, the war does provide various kinds of avenues for social mobility for groups which are on the margins of Indian society. This is true not just in terms of recruitment to the armed forces directly, but also the ancillary war effort which is happening, right? So all kinds of labor battalions had to be raised. You had to do this extraordinary construction of aircrafts, of airfields in eastern India. You had to do these huge supply depots had to be constructed. All of this required, labor and power of a kind that had to be done, right? But the management of the economy itself proved to be quite tricky for the British. And this was again a watershed moment in Indian economic history because, the British sort of government until say the early 20th century used to think of it as a sort of classic 19th century liberal night watchman government, right, which doesn't want to interfere in the economy very much. The First World War forces them to do a few things. The Depression forces them to do a few more things. But the Second World War really accelerates that change. And the British find that they are trying to sort of more or less manage a planned economy in a way that they had never managed to do that earlier. And that has all kinds of challenges for them. And one of the main challenges, of course, was to sort of, how do you finance the whole war effort, right? So now there are only three ways of financing any war effort. You can tax, you can raise money by sort of levying taxes, you can borrow money in capital markets, or you can print currency, right? In fact, the British resorted to everything almost to a degree of 1/3. And the fact that they had to resort to such high levels of what is called deficit financing, or actually printing of currency, was simply because the British sort of war bonds, etc., did not have that much of a stake within India. But the consequences were devastating. Yeah, it led to extraordinary levels of inflation during the war, and that has fundamentally underpinned all of the great calamities with which we associate the Second World War, the Bengal famine, for instance, right? But again, I think historians are too sort of focused on the Bengal famine, which of course was the largest thing, right? Some 3 million people might have died. It was an extraordinary tragedy at that point of time. But the fact is that the Bengal famine was only at the very extreme end of a spectrum of deprivation which was hitting all across India, right? And so one of the things I was trying to do consciously with this book is to sort of, try and understand what is happening in other parts of India apart from Bengal and Punjab, which are the ones which are relatively the best studied, right? So if you look, I sort of looked through all the governor's reports from the various provinces for the entire war period. And what is very clear is that province after province in western, southern India are sort of being hit by this wartime inflation which is happening, right? And has, in fact, there's a very severe famine in the princely state of Travancore, which we consider to be one of the sort of more enlightened states because they had better governance, Sir C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer and so on. But the Travancore famine was quite devastating. And in fact, I actually learned of the Travancore famine by reading some letters of soldiers which had survived in census. And they were writing saying that, our entire village has been wiped out. And this was happening systematically for about a 6-month period. And then I started sort of trying to do some research to find out what is this Travancore famine all about. And it turns out that there is a report on Travancore from 1946, just written after the war. And it was a devastating famine. In Bengal, the extent of the famine was something to the tune of 56 extra deaths over ordinary mortalities per 1,000 of population, right? And in Travancore, which is a much smaller population, the numbers are something like 29. So, you can imagine what the impact of the famine was. So in a sense, the British mismanagement of the war economy in many ways had extraordinary consequences, and the wartime inflation actually had knock-on impact until the early 50s for us. Right? The second thing, of course, was that we were left with this, as the DD said, claims on Britain to the tune of 1.3 billion pounds. Now, just to sort of put things in perspective, 1.3 billion pounds then is to the tune of about $300 billion today, right? Now, that is about the level of foreign exchange reserves that the Reserve Bank of India today has. And then today we are a much, much more prosperous country than we ever were. So you can imagine, if you had to accumulate these levels of reserves, how much of deprivation would have had to be imposed on a society like ours, right? And the whole sterling balances question also proved to be a very, very painful thing for us to resolve, because the British were in no position to pay everything back at one go. And India was invited to be a founder member of the Bretton Woods, at the Bretton Woods conference when the IMF and the World Bank were set up. And actually at the IMF, the Indians tried to bring up this whole business of sterling balances, and they said that, there should not be a bilateral settlement between India and Britain. What if the British say that we're not going to pay? What if they devalue the pound, which is exactly what happened after the First World War, right? So the Indians had all kinds of concerns. And in fact, things like the Bombay Plan, which were drafted by the industrialists, were done in order to lay presumptive claims to these things, saying that, we are actually planning for post-war development. This is money that we need in order to buy equipment. If Britain is not in a position to buy that equipment, we'll convert it into dollars, buy it from the United States, and so on, right? So, but again, the getting those sterling balances, as DT mentioned, took us up until 1956. And it was done in dribs and drabs, in ways that never really fed into any of our economic plans, right? Neither the first nor the second 5-year plans financing could be sort of properly managed through the sterling balances. In a different world, we could have had a much better start, so to speak. And the last bit I wanted to sort of talk about was, the sort of military transformation. And this is a story which, in some ways, is best covered by military historians, and I've largely drawn on their work. But the fact is that there was a very important transformation of the Indian Army which happened, not just in expansion in terms of size, but a transformation in its professional sort of abilities from being, broadly speaking, a policing constabulary force which is focused on internal security and on frontier policing, to a force which is capable of fighting a modern industrial war. Right now, this did not mean simply a question of mechanization and getting those kinds of trucks, tanks, whatever other kinds of equipment. But it also meant a degree of adaptability which was quite difficult for the Indian Army to find, right? Because say when you come to the early campaigns in North and East Africa, you need mechanized forces. But when you come to Burma, you find that most of your divisions have to be once again reorganized because you want to divest yourself of mechanization and bring in all the animal transport and other things, right? So in that sense, the Burma campaign is a very hybrid campaign. You have elements. So the Burma campaign is the last time in the sort of I don't know, maybe millennial history of the subcontinent when elephants actually used in combat, right, to transport troops and so on. So in that sense, it has very peculiar challenges. And fighting these campaigns also imposed various kinds of logistical challenges, which I think again are things that we tend to sort of discount. It's very easy to get caught up with actual fighting, but how were the troops there supported? What kind of food they were eating, right? Because nutrition was a major concern for things. Your average Indian soldier who's coming into the infantry battalions was at least 30 pounds underweight from the standard weight which is given, right, in 1943. How do you get a Jap like that to fight against the Japanese or to do anything? So you had to sort of involve nutritional testing. So a lot of the sort of scientific practices that we established with sort of diet and other things. Similarly, malaria was a huge concern. Blood transfusion. There's simply no technologies available at that point of time to support the troops, and so all of those things had to be created and done in a pretty fast time. So in that sense, the war front was as much of a challenge as the home front was. And the last thing that and with this I'll try and close, is to try and capture the experience of what it felt like for the ordinary Indian soldier to be there, out there and fighting. And there I found it to be extraordinarily difficult to capture the voice of the soldier. Partly because, unlike the First World War, most of the censored letters, etc., are all destroyed. After about 2.5 years of sort of looking for them, I found a sliver of those letters from the Middle East and North Africa for the period from maybe January 1942 to January 1944, which have somehow survived, but in a completely different collection, in a place where I never expected to find them. And those are the only, unfortunately, the last things that we have, and in terms of the voices of the soldier. And I think the one thing which I can say, having looked at that material and a few other things, is the striking difference between the Indian soldier who seems to have fought in the Second World War and the one who fought in the First World War. Right? The soldier who fought in the Second World War may not be writing about politics day in and day out, but he's politically very aware. Right? You have a soldier who's a storeman in North Africa writing home saying that I have heard about something called the Beveridge Plan, which is done in Britain for post-war planning. Is anyone in India thinking along those lines? Right? I mean, that's exactly, that shows the level of sort of political social consciousness which was there amongst the Indian soldiers, which is completely different from that of the First World War. Right? And that I think is striking. And also shows that the impact of the nationalist mobilization and the 20 years of nationalist movement that happened in between. And so the idea of doing this book was therefore to bring in all these different strands: the strategic, the international, the political, the home front, and the war front, and try to make an argument that without the Second World War, it's very difficult to understand the turn that South Asia took thereafter. Right? A simple thing like the partition of India, the creation of Pakistan, is unthinkable. At the same time, the fact that India actually went down the route of a constitutional democracy, where you had things like affirmative action, etc., again have their roots during the Second World War. I mean, the idea of a universal adult franchise-based system was first mooted and supported by Gandhi and Nehru during the Second World War itself. The the whole practice of reservations was first agreed upon by the central government of India in 1944 because Ambedkar as the Labour member sort of pressed for it, and subsequently it was written in the provisions of the Constitution. And the management of the Indian economy in the period of, especially in the 1950s and 60s, right, a period which we tend to think of as a socialist sort of economy, actually had its roots in wartime economic practices. Right, that is the first time that idea of a planned economy came into being. and the extent to which the idea was shared very broadly across sectors of India that planning was a very important device for economic management and all of that. And the last thing is that, even Indian nationalists like Jawaharlal Nehru in some ways look forward to India playing a similar role as a sort of a regional hegemon in the post-war period. But two factors militated against it. First was, of course, the partition of India, which meant that your ability to project force into anything in western parts of Asia tend to be neglected. The second was the sort of involution of Burma and its sort of, the various civil wars in which it got caught up, which meant that your ability to influence events in Southeast Asia, etc., also continued. So, in a sense, it's important to sort of remember the story, because as we are now thinking about what kind of a role that India will want to play in the future, we have to have some sense of what kinds of roles we have played in the past, right? And the past can never be a very good guide for the present or the future, but it's useful at least to give us a template with which to start thinking about issues.
Thank you, Raghavan, for that. Scotland leader Chhina.
I'm conscious I'm sharing space with some very distinguished panelists. I'm also conscious that there's a shortage of time, so I'll try and keep my comments brief. I must confess that actually I found it very difficult to put down my thoughts in any kind of logical sequence, because my mind was just so agitated by so many of the issues that Srinath raises in his book. Many of the things which he actually talks about are things that we have been working with, and I do think that this is actually shouldn't be India's war, it should be India's wars. And one of the things that I'd like to add to what Srinath has examined in such at such great length and so holistically is that much of what takes shape vis-a-vis India and the formation of modern South Asia as it is today actually traces its roots directly to the First World War. And there is actually quite significant, there are many significant events that happen in that conflict which reach their logical conclusion in World War II, just in the same manner as the First World War was actually the Second World War was carrying forward the unfinished agenda of the First. Similarly, the events that played out in South Asia and were a logical follow-on of what had commenced with the events of World War I. Wars, as we're all aware, are actually they act as a catalyst for change in societies and nations. And the First World War laid the foundations for what was to happen subsequently in World War II. Srinath talks about now the interesting to talk about the book. I think it's fantastic. It's a holistic examination in a manner that has not been done before. One of the ways in which I thought I would look at the kind of comments that had been put forward in the public domain regarding this book, and they were quite diverse. There's hardly anybody who said anything bad about the book, but I do find it amusing that in some ways you have public commentators talking about, they're very excited about the political and the social economic aspects, but the moment he starts talking about the military aspects, they say he goes into too much minutiae of military movements and deployments and so on and so forth. In a sense saying that, you're writing about a war, but don't tell us about the fighting that took place in it. We want to know about the politics and about the larger strategic backdrops and so on and so forth. Much of what we have been doing at the United Service Institution where I work over the last few years has been engaging the public with the India and the Great War Centenary Commemoration Project. And through this project we actually, what we try to do is examine the role that India played in the First World War and the manner in which the war in turn impacted upon India, both in terms of, well, in military terms obviously, but also in social, political and other terms as well. Incidentally, I mean, I would actually suggest that the Indian soldiers in World War I were not politically unaware. They were not naive. We have written accounts where there are Indian soldiers who are comparing, in discussion, we've got a diary by a Rajput from Jaipur, and he's talking to, no, not Amar Singh, there's another one here. And he's talking to a British officer, and he's comparing the situation in India with that in Ireland. So, which I thought, was brilliant. There are not very many people today in the Indian academic community who will actually make that comparison. But the fact that the so-called, politically unaware soldier could actually make that connection, I think is very telling. And there are many other such instances. As a matter of fact, I think there is a great deal that happens post-World War I. The events that happened in the Punjab, during the war itself, I mean the whole Ghadar movement, the whole Khilafat movement, all of this has a very, very significant role in shaping the events that subsequently happened politically as well as militarily in World War II. From the military point of view, you have the whole Indianization of the officer corps, the expansion of which, of course, takes place in a very, very huge way in World War II, but commences with World War I. And although I know that you've talked about marginal communities being recruited in World War II, but in the First World War, this was actually the first time that this experiment was tried. When there was, the way that the Brits recruited was recruitment was based on this martial racist theory, which was kind of an outdated concept of social Darwinism. But in World War I, we had they recruited Mahars, they recruited. There are almost about 48 or 50 different communities that are listed, and of course in World War II they went to the extent of re-raising the Sikh Light Infantry, which started off as the Masbi and Ramdasiya Sikh Regiment. They raised a Chamar Regiment, they raised a Lingayat Battalion, and so many others. But the point is that that experiment had been tried previously. One of the things which you didn't talk about, and which actually is something that is the elephant in the room, and that is the Indian National Army. And Ambassador Jayant Prasad talked about, somebody spoke of the president refusing to lay a wreath at, actually in his memoirs he said that he would not lay a wreath, and subsequently he did. Actually, when he went to Papua New Guinea, he actually did lay a wreath at the memorial to Indian soldiers who died as prisoners of war of the Japanese over there. And I do agree entirely with you when I think that it is very, very important that we examine these questions, where the Indian National Army stands vis-a-vis the Indian Army. And I think the fact that we managed to keep the INA out was based on a very, very sound decision that the Indian Army that served the independent state of the Republic of India must be made composed of soldiers who were apolitical, who had no political leanings, no affiliations to that extent. But we still haven't come around to accepting this this proposal in its entirety, and we're looking today at the National War Memorial that's going to come up at India Gate. It comes up around India Gate, which is the de facto memorial of the First World War. But the National War Memorial is a memorial to those soldiers who died post-47. So you have a World War I memorial, you have 47 to the present. World War II falls beneath the cracks, between the cracks. And the reason for that is the INA. There is a a sense amongst the political circles that how do you deal with the INA, that becomes a problematic issue. It does not, in my opinion, because I feel that the INA was not a part of the Indian Armed Forces. And while their contribution to India's freedom is undeniable, it's very significant, but they deserve a memorial separately, not a part of what is being planned at a national level at India Gate. There are two other points, and I'm actually going to quote from your book, which are significant, and they actually point to tie in with what we've been doing, or what we've been trying to say, and I go back again to World War I, and that is that the Indian politicians did not at any given point in time hesitate in using the sacrifices made by the Indian Armed Forces as a bargaining chip for political concessions against with the colonial authorities. The unfortunate thing is that those soldiers found themselves on the wrong side of history, and therefore we have consistently argued that a lack of political identity in 1919 and 1945 has denied the Indian Armed Forces not just of an acknowledgement of their sacrifice or a commemoration of their contribution, but also of their place in history. So, two things. You said the story of India's war is also central to understanding the country's rise on the world stage. You alluded to this in your comments just now. And India is now acknowledged to be an emerging global power, one that could buttress an open and liberal international order. Yet the rise of India was first foretold during the Second World War. I would argue it was during the First World War, when a desperately poor country mobilized to an astonishing degree and simultaneously fought for its own freedom and that of the world. As we ponder India's emerging role on the global canvas, the story of its Second World War provides a crucial starting point. And I think in your conclusion, you say, if it is to revert to its older role as the pivot of Asian security, it will first have to aim at the economic and strategic integration of the subcontinent. This is really interesting, and I would like you to comment on this subsequently. Only then can the rise of India, prefigured in the Second World War, be fully realized. Now, history is a funny thing. Just as for individuals, our sense of history defines who we are. It places us at least within our mind, pegs us in a context, in a larger social context. And it's the same with states. The state has its own narrative of history, which places it within a larger international order. Historians are like the kaleidoscope. A turn of the tube changes the pattern, changes the perspectives. And this changing times demand a re-examination, a shifting of those patterns, a change of perspective. And I do think that today, India has come out of this colonial shadow. We've got, I won't say there's a flurry of books, but there are some very, very significant works that are happening that are re-examining this part of India's past in a very, very significant way, of which Srinath's book, I think, is perhaps one of the most comprehensive. We've had, as he mentioned, Yasmin Khan. We had Raghu Karnad, who forensic history, but again, very interesting book on India's part in the Second World War. We've also very recently had a book on the Battle of Imphal by Hemant Katoch, which looks at battlefield tourism, and it uses that as a medium for suggesting linkages not just between India, Burma, and the UK, but also Japan. So I think that there is it's an exciting time as far as history and historians are concerned, and we need to push the envelope to actually take on board a lot of issues that were earlier just not considered staple or desired fare for the high table. I'll finish, and I would love to discuss some issues subsequently with the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Deshpande.
Actually, practically everything about the book has been said. So there's very little which I have to say. But I must comment on a few things about the book, which I thought was quite wonderful. And when I was called to the book release function at the British Council some weeks ago, and Srinath was there, and the book was advertised, and it said India's War. And I went to the book release function and I said, let's see what all there is in this India's War. Because we were always given to believe as historians and as students of nationalist history that the First World War and the Second World War, both were not India's wars. These were all imperialist wars, they were inter-imperialist wars. And because India was not an independent participant in these wars, that India, as I have mentioned in one of my reviews of this book, India was chaperoned into these wars by her master, Great Britain. With the only difference, I think, that during the First World War, whereas the Indian nationalists became great champions of the war effort as a consequence of their insistence on Indians gaining valuable military and arms training, and even the pacifist Gandhi, who was not a Mahatma at that time but became Mahatma subsequently, was actually converted into a recruiting sergeant for the British during the First World War. And of course Tilak and the other Hindu nationalists were, and all the other nationalists were extremely eager that Indians would participate in the war, and of course there were hopes that if India helped Britain against the Central Powers, then after the war there would be significant concessions coming by way of the nationalists. And of course this became extremely clear during the August 1917 more limited declarations and so on. But the subsequent story is well known that these concessions did not materialize, self-rule did not materialize, dominion status did not materialize. And in fact what materialized was the Rowlatt Act and the uprising in the Punjab, which was a very heavily mined area as far as military recruitment was concerned. So one would have expected Punjab to be very supportive of the war effort after the war as well, but a lot of people were not happy with the kind of demobilization of the armies which took place in 1818, 1919, and subsequently it is nationalist history which became more important in the overarching framework of historiography India developed since then. Now when we, as they say, cut to the slack, we basically come back to the Second World War. I would say it's not the India's, I would say the book is India's war, but I think as Rana has pointed out, and I mean Rana has been working on this First World War project for quite some time now, and we've been part of the commemoration celebrations and so on. Of course some people have said, why should you commemorate a war in the first place? And that's a different issue altogether, but then, and I think we were together at Brighton in the month of May to commemorate the participation of the Indian soldiers in the war again, which became a contentious issue because it became a question of commemorating the participation of which communities of Indians in the war. So that, I mean, everything is fraught with some amount of debate and contestation. So when we come to the Second World War, we look at not India's war, but I mean we are looking at India's wars in this sense. Not only because the First World War is also India's war in one sense, so the Second World War in some ways is a continuation. There are breaks between the Second World War and the First World War. In one sense, the Second World War is a continuation of the First World War, if you look at international politics and the fight against Bolshevism and so on and so forth. On the other hand, in terms of technology, in terms of opportunities, in terms of the sterling balances, in terms of various other things about which my distinguished predecessors on this panel have already spoken, in a way, Second World War is also a break. It is not merely a continuation of the First World War and India's engagement with an Indian imperialist war. So I think Srinath is not really off the mark when he says India's war. When I started, I mean, this is one book which and when Biblio wanted me to review this book, I said, okay, I'll review it, and I reviewed the book in Biblio. The review is available for everybody. And then I got an offer from IDSA saying that they would like me to review this book again. So this is perhaps the only book which I have actually reviewed at two fora. I mean, I've reviewed the book in the Biblio, and I have reviewed the book for IDSA as well.
I hope they were contrasting views.
Well, I could have been very clever. I could actually reproduce the same review in a different kind of language. Historians are quite clever in these matters. They can actually do these things, especially if you've been teaching in the Delhi University for quite some time. You develop this knack of doing things, same things in different classes and so on and so forth. But of course, I mean, you will have to read the IDSA review when it's posted. They have a process of posting it quite late. It goes through the editing process and so on. So, coming back to, I mean, the war has a certain personal resonance as far as I am concerned, because my father fought in North Africa and in Italy. Of course, not much fighting in Italy, as you have said, more of occupation and so on. And my uncle fought on the Burma front. He was wounded there. I spent a formative part of my childhood in the northeast, in Nefa, which was in the thick of affairs from 1943-44 onwards as the Japanese advanced upon India. So there's a personal connection with the Second World War as far as I am concerned. I've also worked on the Royal Indian Navy mutiny, on which I've just published a book and so on. So there's a certain personalized involvement in the Second World War. But I never saw, I mean, for a very long time, I've actually been waiting for a book like this, because this is the sort of historical tradition, the tradition of narrative history writing, which actually went out of fashion in India from the 1980s onwards, when history and the social sciences in this country went through what we call the linguistic and cultural turn. When postmodernism, post-structuralism, post-narrativism became heavy, and it became, it started overshadowing history writing in India. And I think the only historian who has probably bucked the trend since then and who has written broader narratives which try to give us a sense of ourselves in a much broader frame, I think is Ramchandra Guha. I mean, who has written about, who has a couple of books like this. Apart from that, I think we still, we don't value history as a subject nationally as we should. And we were talking about this outside over a cup of tea, really. And we, as Indians, we always like to talk about the past, but when it comes to becoming historians, we don't want to become historians. Of course, you'll have everybody talking about the past all the time, and everybody, of course, nowadays it's very fashionable to go to TV studios and talk about the past and the future and all kinds of things. And of course, last 2 days we have heard a lot of war and so on. War has almost happened in the studios. The studios have almost attacked the enemy and annihilated the armed forces and so on. But then when it comes to talking sensible history or narrative history, we have not really paid attention to this kind. This is a genre, I will say. That this is not only a history of India's war. It became India's war. To begin with, it was not India's war. But it became India's war both in contradiction and in cooperation. And we have been taught as nationalist historians, we've been taught in our textbooks that the contradictory elements of India's war were far more important than the cooperative and the collaborative aspects of India's war. So what I'd like to say about this book, and I think I'd like to place this book in the tradition of narrative history writing, which people like Richard Evans do, or people like Anthony Beaver do. So these are big narrative historians we are talking about. These are the sort of people who give you a history written over a very broad canvas. Of course, they can be criticized for not producing micro-histories which are fashionable nowadays. They can be criticized for not producing monographs. But then they are synthetic histories in the sense that they actually put together a large amount of work. So not only are these, exceptional synthesized histories which they give you with an overview, with both views, the bird's eye view as they say and the worm's eye view, both views are there. So when Srinath is talking about the North African campaign, he actually talks about, he goes into the battalion level movements of the Indian Army, he goes into, he goes into skirmishing, he goes into battles, and then on the other hand he has this very broad canvas, extremely large, broad bird's eye view of the Second World War. It is this ability to combine both these views which I think makes for good history. And I think if you look at people like Richard Evans, or if you, you mentioned Christopher Bailey, I think Christopher Bailey is one of those historians who had this ability to combine these two things. And surprisingly, the book which I was reminded of when I read your book, and of course these are centuries apart, but the book which I was reminded was, Indian Society and the Making of the British Empire. I think it's a magnificent volume, and although both are, he talks about the 18th century and the early part of the 19th century in that book, and you are talking about the 20th century. And I'm not saying that you're talking only about I'm not saying that he's talking only about the Second World War, but he's talking about a book which resonates in the 20th century in general. So you look at the contemporary relevance of this book, and you also look at the historical relevance of this book. When you read it, you realize that there is this total, there's a large temporal space which the book spans, with implications. And I have seen this. I've talked to Malaysians, I've talked to Africans, and I've talked to Afghans, and I've talked to lots of people, Central Asians, and so on, and Uzbeks, and so on. And almost everybody practically, everybody sees India as a country which is supposed to play a pivotal role in keeping large parts of Asia in a certain network of strategic and economic relationships. And that, I think, is an extremely important vision for Indian rulers to follow. And I also feel that at a very vague level, a certain amount of non-alignment, which you also prescribe in some ways, has a very important role to play in this. That India will emerge as a hub of institutions, especially in Malaysia. When I was talking to people several years ago, when I had gone there, and I was talking to the archivists there, the historians there, they said, they always, he said, the 50s and 60s and 70s, we always looked up to India. We looked up to India for a dynamic leadership. We looked up to India with which we've had very long relations. And many of these people had very, they had, now of course, Sagari Chabra has done this work on the INA and the memories of the INA. It's a very good book, I think, and she's gone down the trail. Actually, she's interviewed a large number of ex-INA people who are still there, who have memories of the INA. And one can always say that many of these memories are, post-event reconstructions of the event from a very nationalist and extremely heroic perspective. Of course, you can always deconstruct those memories, but people do remember. People do remember the role of the INA. People, no matter how critical we are of Bose or INA, personally I am quite critical, but I do concede that there is a certain respect which India commands, and much of this diaspora has emerged as a consequence of the labor migrations and the migration of the professionals, and large numbers of people who went to these places in the Second World War as part of the labor corps, as part of the traders. And as you said, that there was this underwriting of the trade of Southeast Asia by the Chettiar capital, which is indigenous Indian capital, Marwari and largely Chettiar capital, which plays a very important role. So you have a very large South Indian, Malayali, Tamil diaspora in Malaysia. And they always said to me, do you really have to be so westernized? Do you really have to follow some other countries? In fact, you are one country which is endowed historically to actually show Asia the way. Because they don't like, for some reason or the other, they don't like China to show the way to Asia. They feel that India is much more, it's a better place in terms of Indian Ocean I mean, the Indian Ocean rim, the kind of societies which, George Alpers talks about, that the Indian Ocean world, there's a certain role, because look at India, it is positioned geographically in such a way that it is in a dominating position over the Indian Ocean. And if you look at this whole geography of the Indian Ocean, you find that Indian diaspora, right from South Africa to Malaysia and to Singapore, it's all full of Indians who all look up to India in a certain way. So I think in that sense your book connects to that vision of India, which is very relevant. So when you say that all history is contemporary history, I agree with you. On the other hand, I looked at the book as a historian, and one of the things which the historians look at very carefully are the sources and the footnotes and the references and so on. And I was very happy to see that the book has almost 100 pages of notes and an index, which is a very large number of pages. I think from 463 to 553, almost 90 pages of references and the index. And if you look at the references carefully, you find that there is practically nothing of relevance in this entire field of study which Srinath has not referred to. As far as I am concerned, as a historian, that's a great achievement, because Srinath is not in a university, he's in a think tank, and he spent a considerable amount of time doing this. And I was looking at the books and I was looking at the articles, and of course I felt quite happy that there are about 7 or 8 citations of my own work in his book, which actually made me feel very happy. Very rarely do you come across a book in which you review a book in which you yourself are cited 5 or 6 times. So of course there's a certain personal relationship which I have had with Srinath also. But I think what I would recommend this book for is the sense of balance with which the book has been written. I have gone through several aspects of the book many times. I've read the book practically almost twice. Once I read it when I was reviewing it for the Biblio, and then I read it again when I started redrafting another review for HACA, and I said, let me go through certain aspects of the book. And the book is very balanced. He doesn't allow any argument to, he doesn't allow himself to be carried away by any argument which is fashioned. So there's a tendency among certain historians to take themselves and their own arguments in their books very seriously. Now that tendency is missing from this book. So he talks about the INA, but he's very careful. It's not only about Bose, because usually people just confound the INA with the Bose, with Bose, and how Bose went to Singapore, how he was parachuted into the INA. But then he begins by talking about Captain Mohan Singh, who played the most important role, who founded the first INA, and people like Raj Bihari Bose and so on, who were extremely active in Tokyo and other places. So, and even the way Bose was parachuted into the INA, the narrative, I think the construction of that narrative is quite well. And then the entire history of the INA, and its the mixed story of the INA, its successes and its failure, both are captured. Similarly, I'm giving you another example. He talks about the development of capitalism in India during the Second World War. The Second World War it was also a great opportunity for Indians. Not only Indians, it was an opportunity for many European capitalists working in India at that time. And there were these 2 Dutch gentlemen you talk about. The fathers of the L&T, Larsen and Toubro. Now, and everybody knows what Larsen and Toubro now is. But how did they begin? For instance, the story of the butter churners which they used to produce, and from dairy they went on to producing spare parts for mortars and so on and so forth, and various other things, and they graduated into a big infrastructure company. And one is almost tempted to believe that the colonial government was actually helping these people and creating a great infrastructure and actually creating great opportunities and support systems and so on, and bang, you've got this Walchand Hirachand fellow who comes up and who wants to establish this aeroplane factory, and he wants to do more. But then he comes up against what is called the colonial bureaucracy. So there's an expansion, and then there's a limit beyond which it cannot expand because the nature of the state does not change in India. So that balance comes into being. Similarly, when he talks about the Quit India movement, the Quit India movement was a very powerful movement in 1942, and it was put down by the British with a great amount of ferocity. Now, who was putting down the Quit India movement? It was not only the British troops, because the British could not actually, they could not deploy so many troops in India at that time in 1942. The British troops were deployed in Africa and various other theatres of war. So Indian troops were being used to put down the Quit India movement. And the fact that the newly raised Mahar regiment, the Mahar regiment was finally raised in 1941, with the Chamar regiment and other regiments, were resurrected during the Second World War. They made their appearance during the First World War and they were resurrected during the Second World War. Now it's the Mahar regiment which actually shows no sign of hesitating in putting down the Quit India rebels and firing on them. And they are praised by the British officers who say that these people are these chaps are very steady. And which only shows that the army has developed, that these new regiments have developed a certain sense of professionalism. Of course, this argument can also be brought in that since the Mahars did not really sympathize with the, probably in certain areas they did not sympathize with the upper caste rebels of the Quit India sort. So there was this caste dimension that the Mahars were not, if you go back to the Battle of Koregaon and so on and so forth, there's this caste dimension of Indian politics also, that the lower caste divisions, the lower caste regiments would not actually hesitate to fire on people who they thought were not part of their community in the first place. So there is this dynamic also. But of course the fact stands that the Mahar regiment by this time is already a professional regiment. And if the officers are saying, okay, look, you've given them 2 warnings, you've shot 3 or 4 shots have been fired in the air, now you take aim and fire. They don't hesitate and they fire at the. So there is this balance that if there's a Quit India movement, you also find that there's a professionalism in the army which is coming in. And that I think plays a very important role during the Burma campaign when you talk about however the dash to Rangoon, the Indians were everywhere. And everybody was very, they were very surprised to see how confident the Indians were. Of course, the INA was patrolling the roads and so on, and the INA could not, basically the INA was not a fighting force. I mean, it could, whenever pitted against the Indian army, it actually withered and could not fight, because the Indian army battalions were far better trained and more motivated and so on. Probably better armed as well. And this is not the place to discuss this. But, by the end of the war, Indians had gained a certain confidence that they could manage institutions, that they could run a professional army. After a long time, after 1857, they had learned to manage artillery. Artillery had, from 1857 onwards, they were denied the use of artillery. Even during the First World War, there were only a few mountain batteries the Indians used to use. The heavy artillery was always in the hands of the British. The British never trusted Indians with artillery because the Indians had used this artillery to deadly effect against the English during the 1857 revolt. So that memory was there in the colonial mind. But in the Second World War, the Indians learned artillery, tanks, workshops, and the fabrication workshops, the innovation. All this comes in handy in the 1950s when a new economy and a new system is being made in India. So there is this sense that there is deprivation, there is the Bengal famine, and I think he's done well to draw our attention to a Travancore famine. People don't even hear of the Travancore. Leave alone Travancore famine, nowadays students don't even know what Travancore was. So I'm getting increasingly, I get students who have not even heard of the emergency. So leave alone Travancore. So, and apart from they don't really know much apart from their Facebook accounts and their Twitter and so on and so forth. And all their knowledge comes from television, TV channels and the Twitterati and the Facebook posts which they find and the blurbs and so on. And what's called the blogs. Blogs is now the new way of learning and reading and so on. So I have now, when I come across students, and I'm talking I don't teach undergraduate students, I'm talking of postgraduate students, I'm talking of MA students in Delhi University, which is supposed to be one of the best in the world. I increasingly come across students who have no sense of chronology, who don't know the dates of the First World War, who don't know the dates of the Second World War, who don't know, half of them will not be able to point out where Imphal is on the map. I teach German history to students who don't know where Germany is. I end up teaching Indian history, and when I talk about Mysore, people don't know the difference between Madras and Mysore. So we have now brought up, in the last 30, 40 years, a generation without history. a generation without a sense of the past, and therefore you find that there is this generation with no sense of the future. And all they do is to, basically follow posts, so half of them become trolls. They go after sensible people. So in this scenario in which professors like me are, carrying on an uphill task in my classroom teaching and in my research supervision, I think we need books like this. We need books like this because these are great synthetic books. These are books which actually put together a lot of knowledge in a new argument. And these are balanced books. No argument is running off to its own trajectory. And I think I have looked at the book not only as a reviewer, but I have looked at the book very carefully as a historian. How does a historian write a history like this? And I think in this kind of meta history, in this kind of overview history, in this kind of history which combines the bird's eye view with the worm's eye view, I think the most important thing is to not lose sight of objectivity and balance, which I think this book achieves. So I suggest that this book be read very, very seriously, very carefully. And I have already prescribed this book to my students. And in the near future, I would like Srinath to come take one of my classes and talk about this book to my students. Thank you very much.
Well, we've heard from two different commentators their understanding and appreciation of this work by Srinath. It's a synthesizing history, we heard, with a sense of the longue durée. It's wonderful to hear such fulsome praise from a professional historian such as Professor Deshpande. And Srinath, you must be very proud for doing such a splendid piece of work. I want to extend, if all of you permit, this session by 20 minutes. The second is that before opening the floor, I had a couple of comments, taking up from your first comment and your last. Your first comment about how the Second World War and the involvement of India in it in terms of how it plugs into India's role in the world in terms of a strategic picture. And the last comment was that the ability of India to affect the larger neighborhood, with India as the fulcrum between West Asia and East Asia, sitting over the vast Indian Ocean space, was circumscribed by the circumstances of our independence. How India actually is, in a sense, a landlocked state, because we don't have overland access to Inner Asia or to Iran or to Afghanistan through Pakistan. So we are cut off from the northwest, we are cut off from the north because of China, and we are cut off from Southeast Asia because of our inability to build connectivity through Myanmar and Thailand. Something that we've been now talking about for a quarter century, the Trans-Asian Railway and the trilateral highway and so on. So, and the paradox of Myanmar, Professor Deshpande said that Indians were confident and Indians were everywhere in Myanmar, but Srinath points out in the book how it is from Myanmar that there was the largest Indian exodus in pitiable conditions, where hundreds if not thousands of people perished on their exit journey from Myanmar to India, precisely during this period and immediately afterwards. So there's another point that is related to what Srinath said. The perception of the Indian national leadership post-independence, of how much they inherited India's role in the sub-imperial system. So there were two strands in Indian foreign and security policy that are very distinct. One is the strand of foreign policy that derived from the experience in the nationalist struggle, the national liberation, solidarity with developing countries, and so on. But the other inheritance, which was equally important because of the carryover of the bureaucracy, the carryover of the army leadership, the sense that you referred to Sir Girja Shankar Vajpayee, India's Agent General, when he talked of India's natural sphere of interest, he spoke of on the landmass between the Hindu Kush and the Arakan Hills, and on the seas from Suez, not to Singapore significantly, but to Shanghai. And the Indian national leadership embraced that vision of India's role in the world, and that's why you had the Asian Relations Conference before we became independent, because the sense of pan-Asianism was something that Nehru wanted to pursue. But the Indian army came in the way of the full expression of a political and a military discourse, or a common security or a cooperative security discourse, which Nehru had at the back of his mind when he decided on this conference. Because when they did their initial soundings, there was also a reticence on the part of India's potential Asian partners about the military presence of India in our part of the world, which was as an adjunct to the British, that we were present in their territories. And so Nehru gave up that notion immediately. I thought I'd mention it. And finally, Squadron Leader Chhina significantly quoted a comment from Srinath. I completely share that. And your last comment, Professor Deshpande, about how India could become a fulcrum of Asia. Yes, our self-image very much is in that direction. But in order to become so, I share Srinath's view that we have to do some heavy lifting, beginning with our immediate South Asian neighborhood and then the extended neighborhood, that India now has the capacity, given its growth rates, if it continues, to undertake the building of regional public goods and undertake connectivity projects that span trade and transportation and energy and ICT, information and communication technologies, and above all build on, again, what Professor Deshpande usefully spoke about, leverage the Indian diaspora and build people-to-people relationships across Asia. So I think there is a lot in this book that is resonating with contemporary India, or even current India of today. And so with these words, I open the floor for any questions. If you have comments, brief comments are also welcome.